Now it's going to be a delight to hear from Emeritus Professor Ngahuia Te Awekotuku. Ngahuia has connections to Te Arawa, Tuhoi, Ngāpuhi and Waikato. She's a member of the New Zealand Order of Merit, a companion of the Royal Society of New Zealand and a fellow of the Auckland War Memorial Museum. Ngahuia has written extensively on Maori history and especially on issues of gender and sexuality in the early Maori world. Kia ora, Ngahuia, welcome. We're really looking forward to your presentation.
Kia ora, Dave. Thank you for that lovely introduction. And ngā mihi kau ana ki a koutou, ane he kōrero paku. I'm really excited about our conversations today, and I regret that I can't be online, or rather visible, like the speaker Alistair and the Irish weather. I live on a volcanic landscape, and our internet connections here are very, very weak. And so Dave, the technician, very kindly suggested that I become a voice rather than a pixelated, blurry, rather steam-infested image on screen. Anyway, I'm going to talk today about some of the work I've done on sexuality and gender, but I'd also like to say that actually I'm an art historian. I'm not a social scientist, and so much of the stuff I've done comes from the humanities, comes from sources like oral history, chant, and of course carved images. I'll talk about some of the traditional record, and then I'll conclude with issues for us to think about. And I've begun with an image that was performed and presented during the campaign against HIV. And this is a group of young Maori men from the Auckland area. And in context now, I'll just give you a very fast history lesson, because I think this explains and contextualizes the world that I live in, which is very different from mainstream New Zealand. One of the things that's special about our land is that, unlike other Indigenous societies and communities and populations, Maori live within islands with very defined borders. And we have over 40 distinct tribal groups, but we have one common language, unlike the peoples of North America and the Aboriginal populations of Australia. Here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, we have one language which is Indigenous, the Maori language, and from the very far north right down to the Bluff, we speak with the same tongue. When we were initially in contact with Pākehā after Cook arrived in 1769, Māori people welcomed literacy with huge excitement, and also, of course, te, which transformed our art, our faces, our world. Metal was hugely embraced and welcomed, but so was literacy and the ability to communicate across great distances with accuracy, so that missionaries were actively invited into community, primarily because they taught people how to read and how to write. And at one point, there were more literate Māori in the country than there were Pākehā. Pākehā being, to those overseas people listening, our word for British and European. In 1840, of course, the treaty was signed with Britain, In 1842, it was when the last shots were fired here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, at Maunga Pohatu in 1916. At the time of the signing of the treaty in 1840, there were over 100 Maori and about 3,000 Pākehā. Most of those Pākehā were traders, missionaries, transients. 50 years later, there were 600,000 Pākehā, less than 40,000 Maori. So that kind of contextualizes where I come from. However, during that period, in 1867, government established 4 seats in the House for Maori representation. In the 1990s, that was on a population basis increased to 7 Maori seats. At the election 3 weeks ago, or nearly a month ago now, all those 7 Maori seats were taken by the fiercely pro-Maori Te Pāti Māori, which is, I think, a great victory for us, although we are in opposition. So when you think about what it means in my world, coming from that background, to be way we are, and at this point I'll say I'm lesbian, I'm whakawahine. One of the words that is constantly used is takatāpui, and something's happened with my screen, I'll have to go back. Māori enjoyed sexuality in many, many forms. Although there was, of course, an emphasis on continuing one's life and having children, people chose partners of either sex for pleasure. And same-sex love was not condemned. It was not vilified. Both male and female lovers feature prominently in the chant poems of their time. And relevant behaviours and even physical details were very fondly described. One example is a rather magnificent long chant, and it describes the of a young man and his prowess having sex, not just with women, but with men as well. And what is interesting, there are a number of songs like this, is that in the late 19th century, a lot of the oral record was interfered with and vulgarized by translation into English. At this point too, I think it's important to note that in the Māori language, in all the languages of the Pacific, we do not have sex pronouns. We do not have words for she and he and her and him. We have one pronoun, which is ia. And so, for example, in the translating of a lot of Māori mythic material, particularly with regard to deities and beings of power, the translators, being either missionary educated or missionary white men themselves, ended up turning everything into male. Currently, we are turning a lot of that information around, so that when you have the Māori creation story of the Sky Father and the Earth Mother and all their sons, a lot of those individual deities were female. They were female. And yet, of course, in the iconography, in the image making, in the 20th century school journals, they are all boys. So that's a kind of issue that one encounters dealing with such a gendered language as English and the languages of Europe coming here to Aotearoa and to the Pacific, encountering communities in which he and him and she area do not exist. Related to this, I think, is as well the notion that any form of sexuality apart from the missionary position in the 19th century world was considered sinful. And one of the more comic and brilliant examples of this is in a lot of correspondence between individual missionaries. And as well as that, I found a number of personal journals and manuscripts, letters written by visiting white men who consorted with various colourful natives. And I think one of them is exemplified in Jane Campion's film The Piano, 1992, where we had a character named Tahu, played by Mika, and who flirted outrageously with most of the male characters in the film. Tahu is very much that kind of personage whom I'll discuss later in the presentation. On screen now is an excerpt from a letter about William Yeat, who was dismissed from the CNS because he was discovered romping in the waves naked with a couple of young men. These young men were also interviewed, of course, by church officials. And to them, and one of them, I will say, went on to be a really talented scribe who assisted in the drafting of the Maori version of the Treaty of Waitangi, as well as the English version. These young men were absolutely unaware that whatever they could possibly fall. And I think coming into an Indigenous world and a place like Aotearoa, like Hawaii, like Samoa, like Tahiti, like the Marquesas, and bringing that frozen Northern Hemisphere bigotry, we do see some interesting transformations occur. Continuing though, and I'm just conscious of time because I want to give you time to ask me questions. People wonder about the words for being like that. As a young woman in a very traditional community, I was surrounded by people like that. As long as we didn't flaunt it, we were okay. If you flaunted it, then you had to move to a bigger city like Wellington or Auckland or Sydney. But being like that was in no way shameful or sinful. However, because of the legal context of the day, it was criminal. And of course, as we know, it was criminal until 1986 and the change in legislation. What were the words that were used for each other? Again, in the oral record, there are words like whakawahine. And whakawahine is exactly the same as the Samoan whawhawhine and the Tongan whakaleiti. It is not about being exactly the opposite sex. It is about behaving in the manner of and assuming the style of the opposite sex. For example, we have a town here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, called Whakatā. The town was given that name by the heroic action of a young female who dragged a canoe from the tide and brought it safely onto the beach. And in hauling the canoe up onto the shore, she said to the gods and to whoever was around her, "Kia whakatāne Awekotuku ho, let me make myself like a man." So whakatā is our way of saying, let me make myself like a man, but it does not mean that I want to physically change my body to become one. And here we get into the conversations and the issues around transitioning and medical intervention and taking on the characteristics, the genitalia, the whatever of the other. I'll leave that to my final slide. I have particular concerns about the way that currently such choices are so glamorized and so exhilarated that many of our young ones think that's the best choice, that's the way to go. But I'll address that later. Looking, though, at the collection or the manuscripts of Wedemu Maihi Te Rangi Kaheke, one of his stories, which is the legend of Henemoa and Tutanekai, actually includes the word takatapui, which means intimate companion of the same sex. And as much as the story focuses on the heterosexual romance between a rather extraordinary female and the man to whom she was attracted, Tutanekai. Tutanekai was in a really intense relationship with another man, and this is described in this manuscript. What is also described in considerable detail is the way that Henemoa, the valorous maiden who swam a huge lake in the middle of the night to get to the island where Tutanekai was living with his hoa takatapui, to attract his attention, she actually assumed the behavior and the voice and the challenging masculinity of a young man. And to get Tutanekai, the male of her voice, into the mineral spring swimming about with her, she smashed calabashes, she threatened his partner, Tiki, the other man, and then she challenged Tutanekai. Now, you don't hear about that aspect of this extraordinary relationship in the published legends, in the 2 films that have been made about this story, in the postcards and the tableaus, and even current music that is being performed, and the type of glamour that has heterosexist glamour that has been sprinkled across the story. And yet it is within this manuscript, now in the Auckland Public Library, that you find, I think, the real depth and richness of Maori sexuality and Maori erotic identity and self-naming in the work of Wedemu Maihi Te Rangi Kaheke. Continuing though, I'd like to mention as well that there is a considerable visual record. As I said earlier, I'm an art historian. In the early 80s, I did a postdoctoral fellowship at Pitt Museum in Oxford, and from there went on to the BM. And part of my quest, I suppose, was looking for what I called anatomies of desire, the visual record, because I rationalized that if there was so much hot oil in the oral record, like in the chant, in the whakapapa, in the mōteatea, then surely there was also, because Maori are an incredibly creative, visually productive people. We make houses are elaborate, they're hugely carved and ornamented. Our canoes are great works of art, and even our most functional objects like containers, musical instruments, and weapons are beautifully designed and decorated. And I thought, well, surely there are elements of same-sex activity out there in some of the images that were collected before the missionaries turned up and destroyed most of them. I've got to say, we have a really strong and tragic art history of emasculation and gouging and grotesque, I think, symbolic de-sexing in many of the collections of Māori work throughout the world, not just here in museums in Aotearoa, but wherever they were taken. So it's been quite a hard project finding them all, but I have found some. In the British Museum, in the Auckland Museum, and in Dresden and Hamburg, there are some very beautiful, finely detailed examples of same-sex erotic activity. And most of this material dates from the 18th century. So it's out there, and it's given just as much emphasis and graphic detail as heterosexual coitus, which is, of course, the principal design element on a number of carved panels, and particularly in musical instruments and also ceremonial containers. I've always argued the evidence is there, we can find it, and in a way, that's my job. But continuing, this is just another lovely image, and I lament the notion now that there is such doubt and discomfort in the world, I think caused by pornography, caused by the immediacy of visual, destructive, peculiar, twisted, misogynistic imagery pouring into our kids' phones, undisciplined and unfiltered stuff. And I'm conscious of the earlier speakers, Joe, Alistair, Jan, Tina, because I think well, it absolutely helps me. So I think that when I consider the world in which I grew up, and I was born after the Second World War. So I was raised in the 50s and 60s during a period of huge social upheaval, even in my community. And for those listening from overseas, my landscape is volcanic, it's thermal, it's steam, it's boiling mud, it buggers up internet connections and broadband. And it always, always, always attracted overseas visitors, so that tourism and the influence of overseas visitors to do visual and oral performance, but also as well how we entertained and mixed with visitors. So that at this point I mihi to a really important gender historian, Chris Brickell, when he observes that Rotorua, this town in which I live, was very much a focus and an ultimate destination for homosexual men. I might also add for a lot of women. Anyway, continuing, I come into my next slide, and I'm watching the time. I think I've got a wee bit of time to answer questions. Here I have what I call issues for karo, and I think that within the Maori world, the most important and driving core value is whakapapa, is genealogy, is kinship, and the connections between the living and the dead. So that there has always been a requirement that humans reproduce. And I know that's a pretty basic thing to say, but when the population of people got down to below 40,000 and was as 27,000 in the 1890s, then you're looking at a really critical situation. We also have a massive wealth of oral history about the importance of continuing one's lineage. But related to that as well, particularly in the world that I know, is that there's a sense of fluidity, not rigidity. And I think this is where medicalized intervention and the notion that one must be one or the other is so dangerous. That in the Ao Tawhito, in that period before Christianity, before the colonial process invaded us, before all of those things, and I think to a huge extent even now, was okay to shift, to change, to explore, to transform, to try different things, and then if they didn't work, to reset and go back, to enjoy absolutely everything that your body, that your emotional landscape, that your world had to offer you. And these continued well into the 20th century. And across the Pacific, there has always been multiple choices, multiple options in how one sees oneself and in how one engages erotically with another. And I come again as well to the notion of naming and how in finding those words like takatapui, like whakatane, like whakawahine, and in more recent times, the invention of a new word, irawhiti, which means crossing identities, that for me creates a whole bunch of questions as well, because irawhiti is a word that's often used by trans activists, and it comes from ira tane, which is the male essence, and ira wahine, which is the female essence, and then ira tangata, which is what has recently been described as by some Maori academics as personhood, or being a person. And then we come to ira whiti, and whiti means to cross over, it means to shift. Unlike other Native communities, we don't really have a sense of being two-spirited. We believe we have many different spirits as Maori, and we move within that world, and different identities or fluidities will emerge at any given point. What's interesting, though, and I just need to mention this, is that celebrity in Te Ao Māori and Te Ao Pasifika has become really tempting. And we know, apart from the appearance of Mecca as in the piano, within the political environment here, we've had some really incredibly interesting trans individuals. The most prominent being, of course, Carmen Rupe, who went on to become a successful entrepreneur and entertainer in Sydney. And then in the context, of course, the glorious and exceptional Georgina Bayer, whom I consider to be utterly singular. On mainstream television and Māori television, as well as the program Takatapui, we have the beauteous Ramon Newake production of Queens of Panguru. And again, this raises that whole notion, which I think Joe mentioned, about being AGP. And I think that the AGP identity is one that fits into whakawahine and whawhawhine. And it's one that I find particularly interesting, because I think as well butch lesbian, and how as a child growing up, I had aunts who were civil. For 6 hours a day, they became women and had to wear skirts to work. And then the rest of their lives were spent in men's clothing. So it's all just so incredibly fluid. And I don't think that in the community of which I am part, we can really be restrictive and rigid, because it just wouldn't work. It wouldn't work at all. Anyway, coming on, or rather continuing, I think too that reclaiming our erotic and sexual identity with reference to our own histories is our priority and our right. After the massive shift to cities following World War II, of course, many, many tens of thousands of Maori living in the towns became disconnected from their cultural and linguistic environments. But in the last 50 years, we've seen the intense reclamation and reinvention of those worlds. And I think part of that resurgence has also been the reclaiming of our erotic and sexual identities. I'd like to finish by saying that this is a Māori problem. This is a Māori issue, and we will deal with it our way. There's no data yet on the levels of pharmaceutical and medical intervention, surgical or otherwise, in the Māori world. Working as I do, because I live here in the village in Rotorua, with my community, my tribe, we're actively involved with Te Whatu Order and certainly with the whole order communities. And it's something that we're watching out for. But I'd like to emphasize again that it's our stuff, it's our issue. We will deal our way. And before I conclude and open to questions, I'd also like to mention, because I note there's no Pacifica contributor to the discussion, that possibly one really intriguing resource to consider is the exhibition by Yuki Kihara, which appeared at the Venice Biennale last year, and the associated videos and book on Paradise Camp, because I think it's for us to define the way we go forward, and it's for us as Indigenous, Pacifica and Māori people to reclaim, to define our own identities. Hoi anō rā kua rahi tāku. I think I'll conclude my talk here and open it to discussion. Kia ora tātou.
Kia ora, Ngahuia. Thank you so much. We've had one question that's come through. Do you have any insight on how the word takitapui was gifted to the entire LGBTQIA++ alphabet soup community?
I don't think it was gifted. I think it was commandeered. And that's a kind of interesting story too, because I found it in my Clovis manuscript. I'll say I am a descendant of Wirumu Maihi Te Rangi Kahiki. He's my grandfather 5 generations back. So when I speak of him, I'm speaking of my own blood. The word comes up in the story of Hinemoa and Tutanekai, and both Lee Smith, who was part of the Māori Language Commission staff, and also a founding member of Gay Liberation Aotearoa New Zealand, and Ngā Tamatoa, the Māori activist group, we both came across it pretty much in the same week. And I told people about it in Auckland and in my communities, and he ran around Wellington telling people about it in his. And we both kind of agreed that we found it together. Even though I'm the descendant, he's not. We never gave it to anyone. It's just there. It's like, who gave same-sex attracted women the word lesbian? I think that it's a pretty good question, but I certainly never made it a gift, and I can't think of Lee doing the same. So I actually think it was just like so many other phrases in contemporary language, something that was picked up and that it fitted. However, it is primarily about same-sex attraction. It's not about rainbow communities, and it's not about transsexual identity, as I see it. And it's, it's about same-sex attraction, the word takatapui. Whereas, for example, whakawahine or whakatahane is very much about moving beyond, assuming that identity, making that decision, albeit for a few hours of your life or for your entire life. It's not
Thank you for that.
takataku.
Thank you
That's
for that.
okay.
Listening to you, I was reminded of the saying, the past is a foreign country. And as someone who did undergraduate studies in history myself, I had to learn to inquire gently and patiently and not bring my preconceptions from today and read them back into the past, or to project the frameworks and preconceptions of past peoples into the current moment. You've given us quite a lot of insight on this, but would you like to say more about what you think the past can teach us as we think about standards of care for children and young people who are confused about their gender and who they are in the world?
I think that the most important, I don't want to say advice, would be if it were well, any child, whether, from whatever cultural background, I think that, like, for me, it's about relationships, it's about loving, it's about compassion, it's about making that little person feel happy and content with who they are and how they are. And if you can do that within your own home or within your own communities, it's a start. I think that, I'm so distressed by the way that schools are using this right, or this model of shaping and influencing young minds and bodies and souls. I think that every child has got the right to be loved for who and what they are, and be happy with who and what they are. And that begins in those primary relationships. It's about, it's about having someone in your life that loves you and says, when you're a 6-year-old or an 11-year-old or a 14-year-old, and not really that happy with how you're looking because you look like the people on your phone, that you're okay, that you're okay as you are. And somehow that's kind of missing, or being interfered with, or in my immediate family, we've got a couple of critical situations, and I know, and I'm doing what I can, that the person wishing to transition had a horrific experience as a very vulnerable little person. And I just think, wait, you'll move through this shit. You don't have to turn into the gender of the person. What got me is that, and this, without identifying anyone, what really got me, this young soul, and I said it to the person's parents, wants to become bodied the person that assaulted that person.
Mm.
I'm talking gobbledygook, but I'll just say that by assuming the outward gender display of the person who abused you will not make you stronger, will not make you
Thank you.
clearer
Yeah.
and better. Yeah.
Thank you, Ngahuia. That also gives us a great transition into our next speaker. Thank you so
Okay.
much for joining us today, and very best wishes.